Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch. Ben, welcome back to you also.
Thanks, mate.
Hey, let's set this up. We are social distancing. We're both in the office in North Melbourne, but you and I are looking at each other through glass windows.
Through different glass windows about 5 metres apart.
5 metres apart in the office here. So interesting ways that we've been trying to navigate doing podcasts each week, Ben, and this is just another unique one.
Well,
hey, you had a webinar last night. How'd that go?
Yeah, good. No, yeah, Picker. So wearing my Picker hat, we had a webinar where Kieran Clare interviewed Rob Honeycomb, who has extensive experience in the Queensland market. So it bodes well, really well for the conversation we're about to have today. So yes, that has been recorded and it will be available for all people who become members of Picker. Go to picker.asn.au, little hook there, get them into the membership. It gives some great insights in terms of what's happening in the Queensland market, but we've also got a very special guest today who's going to take us into a deep dive in terms of what I can only really call as a government shocker. So I'll set it up by saying, that they haven't thought this through. But anyway, that sort of gives us a good segue in. But what do we got for today?
Queensland government shocker, Ben.
Shocker. Shocking call is probably the best way to put it. But anyway, well, hopefully they can reverse it.
You did allude to the fact that we do have a very special guest today, Antonia Mercorella, who's the CEO of the REIQ, is coming on to chat to us very shortly about something that's really important within the state of Queensland. But before we get there, I'm just going to quickly go to my Mindset Minute theme today, Ben. And it's really just a shout out to some folks. Instead of being a mindset in principle, it's really just about ensuring that we honour the folks who have been affected during this time. Yesterday, Ben, as you know, I had my nan's funeral. My 92-year-old nan passed away. I was not able to fly home to Perth and see that. So I was able to watch the service via the internet, Ben, which was second best to being there. But I just wanted to shout out to, I know a lot of people, including Christina and Krista in our business, who have also experienced similar scenarios where the pandemic has meant that they can't go and pay their respects to folks as they normally would. So I just want to shout out to all of the people in our community, Ben, who have been affected by that. We feel you. We understand. I personally understand what you're going through, and I certainly hope that in the circumstances you and your family have been able to navigate that. So rest in peace to my nana, and certainly
well said. Well said. Condolences to those people too.
Best wishes to those folks who have been impacted. But Ben, let's really talk about what we are doing today. There was an announcement that came out just before the Easter break that did affect investors in the state of Queensland. So we reached out to Antonia Mercorella, who is the CEO of the REIQ. She was very gracious in giving us her time. We spoke to her earlier. So let's cut to the interview that we had with Antonia Mercorella. All right, Ben, we've got a very special guest today. We, of course, have the CEO of the REIQ, Antonia Mercorella, who's joined us on the Property Couch. Welcome, Antonia.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's really exciting for us to have you on the Property Couch. Now, we've got a lot of things to talk about because you've been very busy over the last few days in particular, and we're going to talk about that shortly, whilst also, like the rest of the world, navigating the coronavirus. But I guess we always want to pause and reflect on letting our community have a better understanding of who we're chatting to. So clearly you're the CEO of the REIQ now, which is a very esteemed post that you undertake. But we want to learn a little bit about you, Antonia. What was the run up to getting involved in the industry? How have you been involved? What does the backstory look like for you to ultimately be in the position where you are now?
Oh, well, thank you. It's been a little bit of a crazy journey to get here, and sometimes I have to actually pinch myself. But I guess really how I've come to this position is probably about 18 years ago. I'm a lawyer by trade, by background, and I've grown up in Adelaide and did all my studies in Adelaide. I practiced law for a little while, didn't enjoy it, and then went away and did various other things, and then lived in a few different cities, came back to Adelaide, and I saw a job advertised for legal counsel with the Real Estate Institute of South Australia. And I knew nothing about real estate, and I hadn't practiced for very long. And of course, in-house roles are pretty highly sought roles by lawyers who want to get out of private practice. So I didn't really fancy my chances, but I thought, well, what the heck, I'll throw my hat in the ring. And somehow I managed to score that role. And then really in that role, I worked really hard to try and develop a good understanding of real estate law, property law. Really wanted to sort of immerse myself in real estate to understand it, because it wasn't the world that I had come from. And really from there, I gradually went on to become the General Counsel of the Real Estate Institute of South Australia eventually. And then when I left that role, I established a legal practice, and I continued to do work predominantly for real estate practitioners, and I continued to be, I guess, the external legal advisor to the Real Estate Institute of South Australia. So I've been working in this space for about 18 years now. And then about 9.5 years ago, my husband and I, we decided to move to Queensland. My husband is a Queenslander. This is where he's grown up. He grew up on the Sunshine Coast. And I was offered a role with REIQ, originally as their general counsel, and then eventually became the deputy CEO, and then became the CEO probably about 6 years ago now. So that's been the journey. So I'm not a real estate agent. I have not practiced as a real estate agent, but I'd like to think I'm as close as you can get to one without being one.
What were some of the observations that you made during that time? So as you started in South Australia and then progressed through to Queensland, what were some of the key observations that you made during that journey?
Well, I think really the thing for me that the reason that I've stayed doing this is that real estate gets under your skin. I mean, I love it. It's a topic that every single Australian is obsessed with. You know, we all talk about property at the barbecue, at the dinner party on a Saturday night. We're all obsessed with it. And I think if you stop to reflect on that, it makes sense, because shelter is so important. It's what binds us all. It's what brings us all together. We share that. Whether we own the roof that's over our heads or whether we rent it, you know, shelter is essential. It's what gives us a sense of belonging, and it's where we house our families, and it's so important to all of us. And so for me, what I'm really passionate about is really recognising the importance of real estate, and not just at a personal level for all of us, but I think, you know, we really need to, I'd like to see politicians all around this country holding real estate practitioners in higher regard. Our people, our members, the real estate community, they facilitate incredibly important transactions. Here in Queensland, 35% of our population rent, and the vast majority of those transactions are managed and facilitated by real estate practitioners. The vast majority of sales are facilitated by real estate practitioners. And the real estate community has, unfortunately, not the best reputation. It's not held in high regard. And I guess consumer perception surveys do prove that time and time again. And that really disappoints me. And I'm not saying that they're all perfect. I'm not saying that there aren't some horror stories. I know that there are. I acknowledge that. But overall, the vast majority of the people that we work with, that I've been working with the last 18 years, they're incredibly decent, hard-working people. And they wear these multiple hats of counsellor, mediator, psychologist. You know, when we're selling our houses, it's probably one of the most important decisions we'll ever make in our life. When we're renting the property, it's an incredibly important decision. So I feel really committed to raising professionalism standards and within the real estate community, raising educational standards, and I'd really like to see community perceptions about real estate agents. I'd really like to see those levels improve dramatically. So there's work to be done there, and that's really, I guess, what I love about the role that I'm in, and why I seem unable. Every now and again I sort of stop and go, oh, perhaps it's time you should move on and give someone else a go, and maybe it's time you do something not new, but I just can't imagine not being involved in real estate.
And Antonia, what's your personal story with property? Did you buy in Adelaide? Did you sell in Adelaide?
Yeah.
Once, as you said, it wasn't a career, it's a career you sort of stumbled into with your law experience. But what's been your journey as a consumer? Have you ever rented? Have you ever, I'm assuming you own up in Queensland there. So tell us a little bit about that story in terms of your property journey and getting on the property ladder and then moving up through that journey.
Sure. Well, so I'm from an Italian family, as you probably gathered from my name. So Mum and Dad did have investment properties. Mum and Dad, my parents have not had the privilege of an education. They came from a very, very poor background, worked in jobs where they did not earn very much at all, they have an extraordinary work ethic, my parents, and so I watched them buy not many investment properties, but they did buy investment properties, and Mum and Dad always encouraged us to do that. They saw that as being something important, and I think I bought my first investment property in Adelaide, just to be really clear, with the assistance of my parents, so I was really, really fortunate. And I think I was around 24 years of age, and I remember saying to my dad that and I was at uni, because I was at uni for quite a long time, because I did sort of my first degree, and then I started law as a postgraduate. So I was kind of a uni student for quite a few years. And I remember saying to my dad, he had seen this property and he encouraged me to buy it. And I remember saying, oh, it's hideous and the carpet's dreadful. And he said to me, it doesn't matter. It's just about, it's that you got to get your foot on the ladder. He said, don't worry about those things. It doesn't need to be perfect. And Mum and Dad always tell the story of the very first house they lived in Adelaide was literally a tin shed. And they said, just buy what you can afford. And so it wasn't a very expensive house. It wasn't a very nice house. It wasn't in the best suburb. But he was right. It gave me that very first step, and then eventually I sold that, and that led me then to being able to use that to buy the next one. So I have certainly owned investment properties in the past. And now that we've moved to Queensland, we did own a property on the Sunshine Coast as well as a property here in Brisbane. We have sold that property on the Sunshine Coast. So at present, we own our home together with the bank, but we don't have an investment property at the moment, which may surprise some people given where I work. But that's where we're at the moment. But certainly in the future, we're looking at property investment again in the future.
So in terms of professionally, clearly it's a challenging time right now for everyone in the community. None, I guess from your perspective, you're representing the peak representation of the real estate professionals. What are some of the challenges that real estate agents are having to navigate in Queensland that you see that might be unique to your particular state during this coronavirus challenge? And I guess we'll pivot pretty quickly into some of the, the current affairs, because clearly there's a challenge going on behalf of property owners in Queensland, which is quite unique to your state right now, and really out of alignment with some of the other states' proposals to assist folks through coronavirus. So what are your observations, and then we'll tell us a little bit about what's going on in your state.
Well, I think in terms of the immediate impact on the real estate community, of course, real estate practitioners are doing it incredibly tough at the moment. as many within our community are, so they're not alone. I think the challenge that perhaps the community might not appreciate is that, of course, when you are a salesperson, unlike probably the rest of us who get to go to work, and irrespective of how successful we are, we still get to earn money. People who devote their lives to selling real estate, as a general rule, are only paid when they're successful. And so that's a problem at a time when, of course, listings are drying up and we know that the property market will be impacted. So that's, I guess, part one. And, we have seen that real estate can still be transacted at the present time, but of course there are restrictions that have been imposed. So I'm not saying that sales have come to a screeching halt in Queensland, but because of the restrictions that are in place, fewer people are listing, and it is making sales tougher. And then, of course, if you're a property manager, well, goodness me, that's been quite the challenge. We've all known, our Prime Minister announced a moratorium, an eviction moratorium a number of weeks ago. Subsequent to the initial announcement, we also heard the Federal Housing Minister clarifying that the moratorium was not designed to stop tenants from paying rent, and that indeed rent needed to be paid, but that you could negotiate a reduction if you had been impacted by COVID-19, but that ultimately that rent needed to be paid back. And so property managers have been under this, have been acting under this cloud of uncertainty about, well, how do we do that? What do we tell our owners? And so they've been trying to navigate that and coordinate reductions and negotiations. And we've been obviously advocating very strongly for those laws to be passed so that everybody can understand and work to one framework and under the relevant guidelines. So we were really optimistic. We had been working with government on a plan behind the scenes, and we were hoping that we would get clarity really soon. And we do now have some clarity. We do have an announcement. But of course, we're not happy with all aspects of that announcement. So that is the present challenge that we are in at the moment.
Yeah, well, go on, Ben.
I was just going to say, there's been it's been a challenging time in terms of watching what's been happening nationally in this space with regards to some reform that's been going on. We did notice what was happening up in Queensland when the minister released, some initial guidance in terms of their thoughts right on Christmas, which was, you tend to release this type of information when it's not palatable for all, just before different types of holiday sessions. But my observation that I've been making, Bryce, and I've been saying this on our podcast for a while, is that when governments start to provide changes to legislation like what we've been talking about with regards to the Tenancy Act before COVID-19, and now the way in which we're seeing the government's responding right now, it's actually driving a bit of a wedge in relationships between tenants and landlords, which, I've been trying to find some data on the amount of disputes that do happen, and the numbers sort of sit around 2 to 4% of all tenancy relationships with landlords end in dispute. So that means between 96 and 98% of landlords and tenants have a great working relationship with their property managers and have, what we call, comfortable living or peaceful living inside their abode under the contract that they have with their lease. And that's how all landlords aspire to be. We'll always have some greedy bad eggs, just like there'll always be some bad tenants. But on the whole, we do have a really good working relationship. That said, what we've seen in the legislation changes through Victoria and what we're seeing now in terms of what Queensland are trying to implement, not only just with this COVID-19 policy, but just with their general approach to this and the powers that be, is we're regulating to that 3 to 5% of people who are unhappy, as opposed to the 95% of people who are happy. And that concerns me greatly about the types of relationships that will progress in not just now, but also post-COVID-19. So I think it's really important, and it's a nice little segue for you, Antonia, to talk about some of the challenges we are seeing in governments regulating on the run and effectively regulating without any consultation at all with the landlords, with the owners, with the property investors. There has been some consultation with the real estate industry, but we're not all at the same table. And so we're seeing this policy on the run that's being developed. And so can we talk about that? Because what has been announced in Queensland it's a shocker. Let's be honest. Let's put it out there. It's really poorly formed. So let's get into that.
Thank you. Yes, look, I wish I could say I appreciate that obviously we are in highly unique circumstances at the moment, and government has had to act under extreme pressure and in tight time frames. But as you've rightly pointed out, Ben, this is not the first time we've seen this particular minister behave this way and this department behave this way. So look, I guess the reason that we are aggrieved with the announcement is that we feel that our government, as Bryce has pointed out, is breaking away, if you like, and adopting a highly unique approach. So, of course, we knew that the Prime Minister had made it clear that this moratorium was being announced. We have said from the outset that an eviction moratorium at this time is the right thing to do. We are supportive of that. And we've also said, of course, it stands to reason that that you do need to make some allowances for tenants to negotiate rent reductions during COVID-19. So I guess I just wanted to start by saying that, because we are being misrepresented by some who are obviously wanting to characterise us very much as anti-tenant and pro-landlord. So our main issue with this particular package is that, let's start with really the key point, which is that...
Antonia, sorry to jump in there. Just in terms of our listeners, just for clarity, the Queensland Government announced last Thursday, the 9th of April, its renter protection package. And from your perspective, you've come out in your communication saying many details of these changes were very concerning. You said, whilst we support temporary changes to assist affected tenants through this crisis, unfortunately, the property owner has been left with very little control over their asset. And you have some of the concerns as follows. So if you could go into those.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So, yeah, look, so let's start with number one concern. So in every other jurisdiction thus far, what we understand is that everyone is adopting the principle of a rent deferral. And that's consistent with what Minister Sukkar had announced, the Federal Housing Minister, that yes, you could negotiate a rent reduction, but that ultimately you would end up having to repay the unpaid portion of that rent. Our Queensland government, the Palaszczuk government, has taken quite a different stance on that issue. And if you look at the minister's announcements and you look at the hub website that the Queensland government has established, it makes it clear that here in Queensland, what is on offer is that once tenants negotiate a reduction, it becomes permanently reduced. And the landlord will never be able to recover the unpaid portion of the rent again. And just to add to that, what's also being proposed here in Queensland is that there's an immediate right for a tenant to seek a 6-month extension of that tenancy agreement. So not only will that rent be permanently reduced for the remainder of the original term of the tenancy agreement, but indeed it could extend to the full 12 months if they take the benefit of that further 6-month extension. And if you look at the hub website, it gives a very clear example. I'm a tenant. I've been paying $400 a week. I asked for a reduction down to $200 a week. That then becomes the new rent, and the landlord will never be able to recover that $200 that is lost over the course of that term ever again. And the minister has said very clearly he doesn't want to see tenants amassing debts, but presumably he's quite happy to have property investors amassing debts.
That's the challenge, isn't it, Antonia? Because you've got a scenario where there's a perception issue for property investors where they're considered fat cats or, getting ahead of the rest of the folk. But the reality is, because Ben and I see a lot of investors on a daily basis, as would you through your working life, but we get to see under the bonnet of their financials. We get to see what they're actually paying granular, right down to what they spend on their shopping, their pay TV, their fuel, all those sorts of things. And I can clearly say to our audience and anyone who's listening to this that most of them are well and truly on a delicate balance where they have an aspiration to be financially free. They have an aspiration to be self-funded retiree, but currently they are not. Currently they are taking on more risk than the average person with the hope of that coming to fruition down the track. So I think my observations, and I get it, right, because we've got to protect our vulnerable, we've got to protect our marginalised, and the tenants who are in real strife, we've got to protect them, right? So we're certainly not suggesting that we're not doing anything other than doing that. But to suggest, and I think the basis of your claims, and as you'll go into further detail, is the landlord is not sitting on a pile of cash. They are, and that is the perception that needs to be broken very, very quickly. Otherwise, this discussion gets undermined very, very quickly, because the bank is giving a deferral, but they're not giving you a deferral. There's no repayment disappearing, and not only that, there's interest on the interest going forward. So I guess it's just breaking that perception, and I'm sure you've had some people reach out to you on the tenancy side, sort of giving you a rough time as well. But we're not saying, hey, let's dismiss the tenant by any stretch of the imagination. But we're also just saying, hey, don't leave us hanging as property investors, because we're vulnerable too.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that goes to the core of the problem, this perception that if you are a property investor, you must be very, very wealthy and you have the financial reserves up your sleeve to be able to withstand this. But of course, we know that the reality is very different. Of course, there will be some that have an extensive portfolio, and I'm sure some investors are wealthy and do have financial reserves, but the vast majority do not. And I think that's the salient point. And I think the bank issue, I'm sure both of you know, the idea that you can just magically call the bank, pick up the bank manager and say, hey, just put a hold on those mortgage repayments. That process is not as simple as politicians would have us believe. We have heard stories of property investors who have done that, and they are waiting for a call back after weeks. And even if you do manage to press pause on those repayments, it is only a deferral. So the bank's not offering what the government is offering tenants. They're not saying, let's not worry about that. We won't bother recovering that portion of mortgage payment for that period. We'll just pick it up again in 6 months' time. They're saying you will have to pay it back. And as you've rightly pointed out, with capitalised interest. So, and before we leave that topic, there's more to pay than just a mortgage, as you know, when you own a property. You know, I think everybody is so focused on the mortgage repayments. Of course, that's generally the biggest financial obligation, but there's lots of other bills, there's lots of other expenses that are associated with property ownership. And I don't know that that's fully understood by people who perhaps have not owned an investment property before. It is a highly stressful time. And for any of us who have owned an investment property, even just having it empty for a few weeks can send you over the edge. It doesn't take much to send a property investor over the edge. And what's really disappointing about all of this is that the government is ignoring a really key point, which is that these are the people that house 35% of the Queensland population. Now, the vast majority of renters, there's a few who are able to access social housing, but I can assure you it's not the government that does the heavy lifting when it comes to housing the Queensland population into rental accommodation. It is everyday mum and dad investors who are doing that job. And now the Queensland government is coming along, and instead of saying thanks very much for providing that service, thanks for helping us because we can't possibly have them all in social housing, it's like they're getting a kick in the guts and being punished for being fortunate enough fortunate enough, I suppose it depends on your take on that, but you know, having the ability to actually own an investment property. So it does come back to this idea that there's a real demonisation of property investors that is sweeping this nation, and I find it really disappointing. And I do think, to Ben's point, I think this sort of policy really divides a wedge between, it's that us and them mentality, and it really divides a wedge between, creates a wedge rather between property investors and tenants, and that's really unfortunate, and it's not healthy, and I have concerns about that in the longer term, I have to say.
And Tony, you make a really good point, and when we see these types of things coming up, we do like to go to the facts, where there is this perception out there. So I want to also then focus in on, what does a property investor pay the government? Because the irony of this is that you could argue in the revenue that's being generated by these mum and dad investors, by these typical Australians who also need to put food on the table for their family, and who are also potentially, in my view, and why I'm so passionate about the property investment industry, is property investors pay their way. They're trying to provide for their families, and they're trying to say, we don't want any support with the government in the future. We don't need to have a pension when we get older if we manage our money well. So we are paying our way. And so I did some numbers on the Queensland revenues. So land tax, which is paid only by investors, landlords, gets around $1.6 billion in annual revenues, which are increasing every year as the land values in Queensland go up. So that's 1.6 billion. Then there's additions of stamp duty, which is the outside of your royalties, is your number one revenue source for government. That sits at $7.5 billion and also growing again as values continue to grow. So if I look at that, I do some rough numbers just on that 7.5 billion, 35% of that, if that's obviously the rental side, we're talking about $2.6 billion. Now, the irony of this, in terms of the industries or the associations that are most vocal in this space, are funded by property investors. So we are definitely talking about the tenancy associations around the country. Their money comes from government. In fact, I noticed in the relief package from the New South Wales government, they gave them an additional $2.5 million to help assist tenants. What did they give the Property Investors Council of Australia and the real estate industry to assist landlords? Not $1, not a dollar,
not a cent.
So given that we are paying our way and contributing to that, we don't want this us versus them mentality. We do believe we're all in this together. We do want our landlords our tenants to have an enjoyable time in the property, stress-free. If something breaks, we'll cut a check, we'll fix it, we'll repair it. We want them to enjoy their time in that property whilst they're there. And as we say, 96% of those people seem to be enjoying their experience in renting. And I've rented many a property over my journey. In fact, only 18 months ago, I was renting whilst we were renovating, and I enjoyed that experience. I had a good relationship. We paid our bills. We did everything right. So the fact is that we are all in this together, but to also just be mindful to those people who are making comments, and, whether it be on social media or the media themselves or the government departments or the associations advocating on behalf of tenants, which we welcome, because, we want to make sure that it's an even playing field, that money comes from us. That money comes from the property investor, the property owner who's bought that property, paid that stamp duty, and we're talking tens of thousands of dollars there, and then pay annualised land tax bills. That money's coming from us. So if they're respectful of that, we can have a respectful conversation around how we are already helping you. And if we're in a financial position where we can also negotiate a deferral or a repayment plan, as opposed to what the government of Queensland is announcing in terms of for that money to be foregone, that's opportunistic, and it creates a problem where we just don't feel like we're being heard. And so these millions of property investors around Australia who own property in Queensland, who have invested their money in Queensland, and we know how much government says that investment's critical. It's critical for job creation. It's critical, in this case, for obviously shelter. So if we abandon this pathway, how is the government going to pay for the social housing they need? And we are talking tens of billions of dollars, not only in initial investment, but also then in ongoing investment to house all these people who want short-term accommodation or longer-term accommodation. So it does disappoint me where I'm wearing my picker hat in terms of what we're seeing here. So that particular clause is a real concern for me. What other concerns do you also have in regards to what they're proposing?
Yeah, thank you. So obviously I've mentioned that extension where this becomes effectively a 12-month moratorium instead of 6. So that took us by surprise. I just want to explain why that concerns us. So first of all, the obvious reason is that you then go from having reduced rent for 6 months to potentially having reduced rent for 12 months. So that's the obvious financial impact. But it's even more than that. When you look at that, what it means is that let's say, for instance, that Ben, you and I were in a tenancy agreement. Your tenancy agreement was due to lapse, I don't know, 15th of June. So I was planning on moving into that property, or I was planning on having a family member move into the property. I may have lost my job because of COVID. And so I've decided I can't afford to I'll move into that property. So that's just one example. I've been overwhelmed. I've had all of these emails from people who are coming back to live in their Queensland properties and now are saying, where will I go? I was planning on moving in. That was my plan. And of course, you might have been waiting for the tenancy agreement to end with a view to selling that property. And then the really concerning part, and this is where it worries me that they haven't properly consulted and haven't properly considered the impact of this, is that imagine the number of contracts that are already on foot where the settlement date of that contract has been negotiated to be a date that comes after, in your case, let's say I've made it the 1st of July because I know our tenancy agreement's coming to an end. And so that's what the settlement date looks like, so that the new incoming owner can buy it and there's no more tenancy agreement in place. So you've got potentially a family of people waiting to move in. What impact will that have? Because all of a sudden the tenant can say, no, sorry, I'm not moving out. So they haven't thought about these sorts of things. And of course, the other big issue is, and you'll have to forgive me for jumping around, but different parts of the package actually intertwine and connect. Because when you read that 12 months, that 6 month extension, and then you add to it that a tenant has the right under the terms of this moratorium to refuse entry for anything other than emergency repairs, you then think to yourself, well, how will I ever be able to sell a tenanted property during this period? Because, I mean, let's be honest, sure, there's probably a few very limited cases where someone is prepared to buy that property. Let's call it that it's a block of units, they're all the same. In that context, possibly you might get someone who's prepared to buy it without stepping foot into, through the door. But as a general rule, no normal person, no reasonable person will buy a property without physically inspecting it. Of course, we know in the vast majority of cases, people want to have pest and building inspections done on it. Valuers need to get in to confirm, that the bank's going to give you the money. The list of people goes on. And so if you read that, when you put those two things together, 12 months, no entry, you do start to wonder what it's going to do to the sales market. You really start to wonder about those owners who have really got their back to the wall and say, I'm all out. This is the straw that breaks my back. I can't afford to stay in. This will send me broke. What do? Do they just sit there and wait until it becomes a mortgagee in possession sale and they end up with God knows whatever dregs they can possibly have at the end? So these are the sorts of issues. It is, it's not just one simple thing. It's not just one thing we're concerned about. It needs to be assessed. The entire package needs to be assessed and it needs to be considered. And I'm worried that they're doing this on the run and they're not properly consulting, and we haven't seen the bill yet. So you know, you can only wonder what other surprises will come when we see that proposed legislation in detail.
I mean, I'm just thinking of another example where I'm an owner-occupier, and we always say, you know, the safest bet is to sell your house before you buy another property. You don't want to be caught out. So I go and sell my property as an owner-occupier, and then I find this property that I absolutely love. It's got a tenant in it, but I know the tenancy agreement's coming out. It's going to put me in a location where I want to raise my family or whatever. So this is a great outcome for me. And so I sell my house and it's going to settle. And then I realise, wait a minute, I can't even get into this property now because the tenants decided to just hang around because they have a legal right to, you know. Now that's new information, right? That's policy on the run. We all knew about the 6-month moratorium, so I would have put that into my planning. But when governments come out and then just change the rules to a 12-month moratorium, that's another perfect example of how the free market, the open market, doesn't work well and puts financial consequences onto all parties concerned.
I'm glad you raised that as an example, Ben, because we actually have some friends, some personal friends who have been, they decided to go and rent and try apartment living for a little bit. So they've rented out their family home to others, and indeed that tenancy agreement was due to end, and they then gave notice to end. They want to move back into their family home, and he's now saying, how will I do that? The tenant will be able to stay, and then where will we go? Where will we live? So, I mean, you know, he's already given notice to say he's going. He did that pre-29th of March. So, you know, there's 1,000,001 other examples. There's so many scenarios we could talk through, but that's why that 6-month immediate extension without any qualifications to it, it doesn't work. You know, the only qualification is if you manage to get that notice in before the 29th of March. But otherwise, the way we read the Hub website and the way we've interpreted the Minister's announcement is that tenant gets to stay for a further 6 months, and there's not a thing you can do about it.
Antonia, it seems to be out of step with the other states, particularly Victoria and New South Wales, and maybe a little bit ironically, given that the median rent in Victoria and the median rent in New South Wales is much higher than Queensland, and
Right.
you know, the median rent for Queensland is around the $400 mark, and given that there's now some stimulus packages in place, probably put and I mean with full respect to anyone who's doing it tough, right? So I don't want to marginalise them, but it would appear that Queensland is the beneficiary of the same stimulus package that is across the country, given that they've got lower median rents than the other, and yet they're out of step with their immediate neighbours.
It's a great point, Bryce, and it's not one that we haven't put to the Minister and to the government. In actual fact, the median rent in Queensland, if you don't mind, is actually lower. It's $355 for a 2-bedder in Queensland and $360 for a 3-bedder. It is higher, obviously, in New South Wales as it is in Victoria and various other jurisdictions. But you're quite right, and like you, I don't want to offend anyone who's in financial distress. That's not my intent. But you're quite right. The federal government has announced a stimulus package that is the same across Australia in terms of the money, the dollar that is on offer. But we have the benefit, if you like, of having lower rent here in Queensland. And so when we think about that measure that the Hub website refers to and that many refer to, which is that as a general rule, up to 30% of your income is what you should be dedicating to rent or to your mortgage payment if you own your home. So when you do those sums, even if you have lost your job or your hours have been reduced, when you take into account what's on offer at a federal level, and then perhaps you add in what the state government is also offering, it does appear that the vast majority who are on that median rent level, that they will be able to meet, if not all of their rent obligations, certainly most of the rent obligations. And that was the other point we made to the Minister. Indeed, when they came out with the stimulus package, I had that very same conversation with the Minister, and I said, well, that should fix most of this. Because I said to him, given our median rent, given what the feds have announced, that should hopefully go a long way. That should really diffuse the situation and give everyone a lot of comfort and a lot of certainty. And that's also why we're so surprised that they've adopted this permanent waiver system rather than a rent deferral. It really does defy logic, and I don't know why. We love to be unique in Queensland. It's one of the things I love about this state. But in this instance, I'd rather not be unique. I'd actually rather go, be part of the rest of the team.
Well, it could be counterproductive, because if you've got a scenario where you've got landlords who are being defensive and the tenants have to negotiate with the landlords are less amenable to that negotiation, given that they are coming from a position of being on the back foot versus all of the things we've just discussed. And as both of you have talked about before, the majority of landlords do the right things by their tenants. So it seems like the Queensland government is trying to protect a group which could backfire them through the counterproductivity of the measures that they're putting in place.
Absolutely.
I think from that point of view, this is the two biggest challenges we've got in this particular space. I mean, the tenancy associations do a great job in helping our most vulnerable, right? And we all agree that what's great about Australia is our safety net in terms of how we can have health services, and we've got a pretty good safety net. We could always do better, but what we don't want is a safety net that catches 50% of the population. We need a safety net that catches those most vulnerable and the hardest hit in our society. And that's what I say. I think the tenancy associations around the country do a great job in sort of helping those people through difficult times, and they have money to do that, and they have grants and vouchers and which they can provide for those people in very, very difficult circumstances. And so, all credit to them in that particular space. But coming back to the point about the job seeker and the job keeper payments, those payments are absolutely ample in terms of supporting the vast majority of these tenants who now feel, or based on the information they've been given, that everyone should be asking for rent relief. Because we had a webinar last night for Picker and with one of the successful property managers up there in Queensland, and he was saying one of the tenants that asked for rental assistance was someone who signed up to a rental property who was already on New Start, so they were already unemployed, and now they're getting double the unemployment payment, but they still want what their rent reduced. And so for me, it's like that's taking advantage, right? I mean, ultimately, you're already getting subsidies. You're now getting double the subsidies. We can't expect landlords to then have to bend over for that type of opportunity to come through, right? So that's the point for me in terms of and dealing with what is hardship. So I probably wanted your view from the REIQ's point of view in terms of how does a property manager, when the government's also said you can't make inquiries about their financial situation? Can you share that with us?
Yeah, look, it's such a good question. I mean, we have been smashed on our advice line where property managers have said, so what do I do? How do I negotiate? So we had put out some documentation in the absence of anything from government. We put out a document and we set out a list of questions that we thought were reasonable questions to ask the tenant. Minister de Brenny's made it clear that he doesn't think that's appropriate. I will just say for balance and for accuracy, so we, based on what we had read and what he had said, it seemed fairly clear to us that his original announcement was that you couldn't ask for anything. His office has now reached out to me and said, there's certain things you can ask for. We're yet to see exactly what that looks like, but some of the examples they've cited is a separation certificate. So clearly that shows that someone's lost their job. But then they've made it clear that actual financial information, that's not to be shared. So that can be shared if you end up at the RTA in mandatory conciliation. So you do have to wonder, Ben, it's a good question. How as a property manager then do you go and make representations to your owner to say, hey, listen, this is my advice. The whole point of being a property manager is to give guidance to your owner. How will a property manager do that? Because if you have a separation certificate, yes, that demonstrates that they've lost their job. It doesn't necessarily tell you, though, how has their income been impacted exactly. Like, you're not allowed to ask for specific information. So I don't know, because on the one hand, the website gives that guidance of 30% of your income as a general rule is what you should dedicate to rent. So surely we should be able to ask for information then that allows us to make the decision about, okay, well then that's going to be our guiding principle. Let's look at what that means in terms of how much what that reduction needs to look like. So there's none of that. And the other thing is that in New South Wales, what they've done there is they've actually introduced a threshold requirement. So you can get the benefit of the protection, but only if your income has dropped by 25%. And so there's no threshold test here in Queensland. So, you know, you might argue that you've been impacted by, I'll be facetious, $20 a week. And then you might go into bat for, you know, a 50% rent reduction. Well, clearly that's not reasonable. And in a verbal discussion we'd had with one of his representatives, she had suggested that the guiding principle should be that's been adopted in the commercial leasing code, which, as you may be aware, the way that works is that the commercial landlord needs to reduce the rent by the equivalent amount. It's a sort of a proportion test or guiding principle. And so whatever the business's turnover, whatever that drop is, that's the equivalent reduction you have to offer in the rent. And a representative out at the Minister's office has suggested that that's a good guiding principle too. Now, that's not on any formal website and it hasn't been formally released. But again, how do you do that if they're not having to give you any of the documentary evidence you need and you're just being asked to take them on their word? Now, again, I don't want to be inflammatory and suggest that tenants are liars, but let's also not be naive. Of course, there will be some who seek to exploit this. And in circumstances where there's a landlord at the other end who's got his or her own expenses to bear, it's entirely reasonable that you should say, for me to consider your reduction request, I need you to substantiate it. How is that unreasonable? How is that unfair?
Look, I'll just make one quick comment on New South Wales. The 25% loss of income is simply to claim that you are getting a hardship by losing 25% of your income, when we've analysed literally tens of thousands of household budgets, and 25% is just in the discretionary spending. Now, you can't go to a bar, you can't go to your gym, you can't do any of the discretionary spending that you've traditionally been able to do. That does not signify to us that it should kick in at a 25% reduction of income. It should have kicked in at a 50% reduction of income. So we are quite critical of that test out of Sydney, out of New South Wales, because what that also means is that then forces the landlord and the tenant to a negotiating table, of which if they can't mediate anything, they're off to the disputes tribunal.
NCAT.
Now, NCAT. So that's difficult. So I think again, if they had consulted us, we would have said to them, look, here's proof in terms of our household budget works. You only need to look at a hem in terms of household expenditure, and you can see basically what's essential and what's not. And rent is essential, as is obviously paying your mortgage is essential. But 25% can be washed up in predominantly discretionary spending. 50% can't. And so that's my view. And I think what Victoria's done, just quickly, with the $5,000 bank savings, or proof of savings of $5,000 or more, is a good start. So people who, I've been on this all along, you should always have an emergency buffer, and that's what this is for. Events that, yes, you're not in control of, your car breaks down, you don't like that either, you're not in control of it, but you've got money to fix it. Having good money management and saving for these buffers, as opposed to 28 years of positive economic growth where you don't do that, is another highlight why we are going to work really hard in continuing to teach people about money management. Because if everyone did have those buffers, now not everyone can. I realise there's a small percentage of the population who do it tough and they don't have any money, but others have got to look at the way in which they manage their household budget to get to a better management of what is essential and discretionary spending.
Yeah.
Hey,
Sorry,
Antonia, just being conscious of time, because there's two things I want to talk to you about. There's one other thing that we need to chat about that is a concern of yours, and then of course we want to get to the bit where we can actually help you with your aims here. But the final one in your correspondence was around the fact that how tenants can break their lease. Can you talk a bit more about that, please?
Yeah. So what the minister's also announced is that in addition to the various other protection measures we've already talked about, a tenant is also able to break a lease, so effectively walk away from that rental property, irrespective of whether you've just entered into it and it might be a 12-month lease, or even if it's halfway through, you can walk away. You have to give 1 week's notice. Therefore, 1 week's rent needs to be paid. And I guess our concern about that is, as you can imagine, you've got a landlord's hands being tied, as they should be. No evicting this tenant. Make sure you negotiate the rent reduction where it's warranted, and various other things. Then you've got this obligation to offer an immediate renewal. But then right at the end, there's this rather odd right that a tenant has to actually say, irrespective of all of that, I actually want to be able to leave this tenancy agreement and I'll give you 1 week. And the problem with that is, as you can imagine, it means that then the landlord is required to go out, procure a new tenant, which in the current environment will not be easy. There'll be a letting fee associated with that. There'll be advertising expenses associated with that. It's unclear how quickly they will be able to find a tenant to fill that gap. So potentially, on top of everything else, they then have to wear the financial burden that's associated with that. And of course, in any other normal circumstance, when you break any contract, whether it's a tenancy agreement or any contract, you're up for damages. So in this context, you would be up for the level of the rent until a new tenant is procured, and potentially also the letting fee and advertising expenses. And there are some sort of exceptions to that rule. So that's also concerning, and again feels a little bit like, this is another reason why we're saying it's called a protection package for landlords and tenants, but I've got to say it feels a lot like a protection package only for tenants.
Yeah, and I think what's the title of your campaign? Fair for everyone, or what?
Everyone matters.
Everyone matters. Yeah, I think that's really really poignant. Hey, I think for declaration to all of our listeners, Ben and I are both Queensland property owners, so it's important to acknowledge that. So we've obviously got an agenda, but it's, for the bigger picture, you wouldn't want this to go across the borders, and you wouldn't want it to infiltrate into other states and territories. So can you share with our listeners who are interested in property in general, and also those who have properties in Queensland, how can they help be a voice behind what you're trying to bring to the attention of the Queensland government?
Thanks, Bryce. So just before I say that, can I just say thanks for declaring that you are both owners of investment properties in Queensland. But I would say that this actually is of interest to every single person who lives in this state. Even if you don't own an investment property, Ben took you through the huge volume of revenue that property transactions generate for the state economy. And that money provides services and infrastructure that every single Queenslander benefits from. So even if people are listening to this thinking it doesn't apply to me, I'm not an owner of an investment property in Queensland, if you live in Queensland, it does actually impact you. So I just wanted to say that quickly. In terms of how people can get involved, it's actually very, very simple. If you go to a website, and I'll give you that address in just a minute, there's 2 letters on that website. One is a letter that we are asking real estate agents or anyone who has a connection to someone who's an owner of a Queensland property. There's a letter that spells out what our concerns are. It's a simple 1-pager. So getting that letter out to property owners is essential. And then there is a template letter that we have created that is to be sent to Anastasia Palaszczuk, our Premier. asking for balance and asking her to reconsider certain aspects of the package. And we need people to act really, really quickly because Parliament resumes and sits again on the 22nd. So the window of opportunity is very, very narrow. And the website address, I should have written it down before coming on air, is www.reiq/everyone-matters/.
Now, what we're going to do for you to make that really easy is people usually listen on their phones, some listen on their desktops. We will put that link in the show notes to make it incredibly easy
Brilliant.
for
Thank
people
you.
to link. Now, I did it last night. My wife did it last night. And folks, I know what it's like when someone gives you a call to action and you think, yeah, I'll get around to that, and you don't. What I do want to support in this case is it took. I clicked on a link. It had an open letter. It gave me an explanation of the points that Antonia has just run through. And then it gave me a link to go, if I am a landlord versus if I'm an interested property person. So I clicked on the landlord. And all I needed to do, it was very simple. I needed to Control A to copy the whole piece and put that into the body of an email. And then I needed to right-click the email address and push copy, and then go back to the email and push paste in the two. And then I needed to click the name of the email and I needed to paste that into the email. That is it. And then push send. So you made it very simple and very straightforward for folks to do.
Right.
So I do want to encourage anyone who does have a genuine interest in Queensland, in property in Queensland, and even for those folks, because we have listeners all around the world, to be honest, but we have listeners all around Australia. If you want to support the property industry in our country, we certainly encourage you to make your voice known to the Premier, so that at least the likes of Antonia can have a conversation. Because again, at the risk of going over old ground, we are not trying to find a package to marginalise tenants and make landlords have a free ride. You're proposing that everyone matters and that everyone has an equal share of what's going on in something that's been totally uncontrollable to not only this country but everyone around the world. So we thank you for your efforts for doing that.
Well, thank you both so much for the opportunity to come on, to share our concerns, and thank you for throwing your support behind the campaign. It's much appreciated.
It's a pleasure. Keep up the work that you're doing. I'm sure it's relentless at the moment, but clearly there's a bigger agenda that you're chasing.
And it would be remiss of me not to also forget to say to all property owners who have investment properties that this is why we work so closely with the estate agent community. So I'm wearing my picker hat again, because we don't have millions of dollars coming from taxpayers to run an association. We're all volunteers. The Property Investors Council of Australia is for you. It's run by property investors. It's trying to give a voice to property investors. And then when we know that the associations and the real estate industry is getting behind the work that we also want to do, we'll continue to support that. But please, if you're not a member of PICA, we represent the 2.5 million property investors across Australia, but we do need your support, both in terms of voice, in terms of helping Antonia with her cause and our cause, but we also need that financial support to be able to deliver the services that we want to deliver and advocate on your behalf and educate you around the risks and also potential rewards of investing in property. So I needed to also throw that little plug in at the end there as well.
And all the details will be in the show notes. But again, Antonia, we appreciate you've given us some of your time in a very busy time for you up there in Queensland. Thanks for coming onto the Property Couch, and we appreciate all your efforts.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
So there you have it, Ben. Obviously, Antonia was very passionate about that, and she certainly was. I think it's important to understand that she was going to great lengths to really try and say, we want some balance. We're not trying to swing the pendulum all the way to the landlord. We actually just want to meet in the middle. We actually want to honour and respect those tenants who are in genuine hardship, and let's look after those vulnerable people, but let's not do it at the expense of the landlord.
Yeah, and I think the other takeaway for me is it's everyone in the property industry is affected, like in terms of that's owner occupiers and landlords and tenants. This is not just in isolation. And I think she documented that really well in terms of how the flow-on effect of not having an open market working properly can have intended and unintended consequences right through the whole program. So it's difficult times, we get it, but we do call out poor policy that's been consistent with who we are from day dot, and we call out good policy too. So from our point of view, we hope that will be restructured, rethought, and cleared up where we think it'll be beneficial to all parties concerned.
But we had the call out at the end of that interview, Ben. We just want to reinforce that if you are a property lover in Queensland, you, as Ben said, you're either a tenant, you're a landlord, or you're a property owner-occupier owner, it does impact you. So we've got the links in the show notes for you guys to go out. As I said, it is very straightforward to do, folks. You could do it on your iPhone now whilst you're listening to it, or your Android phone for those folks that are using Android, Ben. And really show your support so that we can get that balance back. Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is regarding homeschooling. My kids went back to school today. Some kids went back to school yesterday and the day before here in Victoria. But my wife is obviously sitting at home, facilitating that with Jack and Sam. And one of the tips that she got during the week, which might be beneficial, is to ask the kid, because clearly you're not being asked as a parent, you're not being asked to be the teacher, you're sort of being the facilitator for the teaching that's happening online. But there are subjects that the kids like, subjects that the kids don't like. I asked Sam last night, tell us the subjects that you do like, and he said sport. I said, all right. Any others? And he was at pains to let me know, but slowly let us know there's a couple of others. But Andrea's asked him, okay, for the ones you don't like, ask them, if you were the teacher, how would you actually teach those subjects? Because what you do is you get some little insights into how they would respond to that particular subject that they don't like, so that you can tailor and pivot and actually give the learning appropriate to the child at each particular stage that they're at. So today my life hack is around that homeschooling that a lot of parents are doing across the country right now, is to, if there are subjects that they don't like, ask them how they would teach it so you can get those cues so that you can encourage the interaction for those subjects at their preferred learning style. Ben, did you know?
Well, just a quick little shout out also to those parents who have to also manage working from home and also their kids at home, right? That's hardcore. So, good on you for doing what you're doing. And I'm sure your bosses will be respectful of the fact that, especially young kids in primary school who can't sit still in their chairs, be appreciative of the fact that if a parent is homeschooling and also trying to get some productivity and work done for your business, just be a little bit more understanding of their situation.
Mm-hmm. Well said. So, Ben, did you know?
So did you know, Bryce? Well, I thought, did you know I'm going to do something a little bit different today, right? I'm bringing in a little special guests for Did You Know?
Mm-hmm. All right. We're going to the lab?
We're going to the lab, Bryce. We're going to go to the lab. I thought it was just timely that that we'd get some information from the Capital Growth King in terms of what he's seeing out in the marketplace, with a couple of little spins on the world in terms of what's happening in the property space. So, Jeremy, what have you seen out there in the data so far to the end of March?
Well, surprisingly not much, actually. Over the course of March, there really wasn't any change in overall demand to supply ratio. So it's actually been quite boring. Looking at the couple of weeks since the lockdown, however, there's been an increase in stock on market and a dramatic reduction, obviously, in the number of sales. But that's about it, really.
Okay. So one of the things that I did promise for this Did You Know right now was, what's some of the little quirky thing you've seen? And this relates to renting versus owning.
Yeah, well, this is a very unique interest rate environment we've been in. So there are now an enormous number of suburbs. When I say enormous, it's actually still quite small, but historically you would see maybe 1 in 1,000 suburbs around Australia where it's actually cheaper to own than it is to rent. And that situation has changed dramatically because of this low interest rate environment. So we've got a little bit of correction around the country, especially in certain parts in prices. Rents are still reasonably high. Vacancy rates are still quite low, but interest rates are dramatically low. And so we've seen a dramatic rise in the number of suburbs around the country where it is now actually cheaper to own than to rent.
So what sort of percentage now? So you say 1 in 1,000. What are we at sort of now?
We're talking about maybe 1 in 20, and it depends on the circumstances. So if you're a buyer and you are paying, say, a 90% mortgage, so you've borrowed 90% of the value of the property, you're paying interest on that mortgage, that's obviously more expensive. And if you're paying principal and interest on top of just interest, you're paying principal as well, then that obviously hurts your cash flow more. And if you've bought a house rather than a unit, that hurts more. So in those sort of circumstances, not really that many. It might only be say 2 or 3%. In fact, if you then restrict it further by saying, all right, you're not allowed to buy in regional markets where there's a population of less than 100,000, then it really restricts the number of cases to less than 1%. But if you are an investor and you're paying interest only, you've got an 80% loan to value ratio, and you're still restricting to significant urban areas where there's a population greater than 100,000, then you're looking at around about 3 out of 100, so roughly 3%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's unfortunately most of the problem areas. So if I can just consult my list, first of all, I rounded everything up to the state level, and most of the markets are in Darwin, Hobart, a few in South Australia. So it's Tassie in general. Queensland has a few things, places like Townsville, Toowoomba, Mackay, Cairns. So the pockets are in generally cheaper areas. So they're outside Sydney and Melbourne. In fact, Melbourne had no cases at all, and Sydney only had one. And it's where yields are quite high already. But with interest rates reducing, it's now increased the number of cases. Toowoomba is another one, Ipswich, Adelaide South, Perth Southeast, and the ACT, Logan, Bow Desert, that sort of area. So they are generally cheaper areas. They've had high yields in the past. Those sort of yields have been maintained, and on top of that, we've got a reduction in interest rates. And it's really increased the number of cases.
And I suspect that might start to increase even more as interest rates stay lower. So thank you, Jez, the Capital Growth King. You can check out all of the data from Jeremy and the team, the research team at selectresidentialproperty.com.au with all those data insights. But thanks for that, mate. And Bryce, that was my
Thanks for having me on the show.
I didn't even need to. I didn't even need to do it.
Ben, it's not lost on me that was possibly the best Digino we've ever had, and it's certainly not lost on me that you outsourced it. So
there we go.
I'm not sure you can take any credit for that, but
thanks, Jeremy. That was great.
Appreciate Jeremy doing that. So there you go, folks. Hopefully that's been helpful with you, Ben. I did not know that, which is good.
There we go.
Insights that you provide in your segment that you alone provide, so which has been good. Hey, folks, thanks for tuning in to the Property Couch this week. We certainly hope that the message has been something that's been useful for you. We appreciate Antonia again coming on to share some of the concerns that they have around the rent relief package that they have there in Queensland, Ben. But interestingly, Ben, I was going to say until next week. But what I'm going to say to you is until next episode, because we're going into double today.
If anyone's hung around to this final bit of the show, they will know that we're about to interview the REIV state president. Yes. So we're looking forward to that. That episode may be coming sooner rather than later. So stay tuned if you ever hang around. If you've hung around, I should say. But until next week, Bryce, knowledge is empowering, but only if you act. I.e., write to the Premier, fill in the form, do what we said you do, because it's a Queensland Government shocker. So only if you act on it. Thanks.
Well said, Ben. See you on the next episode, folks. Hey there folks, Bryce Holdaway here. Before you go, if you're new to our community and only listened to maybe a handful of episodes, I thoroughly recommend that you go all the way back to episode number 1, where we unpack all of the foundations when it comes to property investing. Now for those of you that might be a little bit time poor, I've got good news for you. We have a binge guide that you can download straight away, which summarises the first 20 episodes where Ben and I unpack the foundational pillars of the A, B, C, D and so much more. And you can get that straight away. If you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20, you can download it and consume it whenever you want. It's completely free and available now. And for those of you, just a quick reminder that nothing we've spoken about today constitutes financial advice. We recommend that you reach out to your licensed professional advisor so that you can look at your unique circumstances before acting on any information. Now don't forget, go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20 and get your binge guide today.